Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and this morning I saw a subscriber kind of ask a question, which I'm going to flip in for you guys here. And, alright, he basically starts off a question by saying, hey, if training to muscle failure is all you need for growth, then X, Y, Z, etc. He goes on into all this diatribe here. Alright, this is something that I see a lot of in the fitness community, particularly the online fitness community, that really needs to be addressed, and there's some problems here. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing. Let's do a little crafting and let's talk about this. Alright guys, in short, the cliff notes. Training to muscle failure isn't that big of a factor in muscle growth actually. It's just one potentially useful tool. So if you don't understand that, then we got a problem. Number two, people have a bad tendency to take false premise. You know, because if you guys know basic logic, the elements of reason, things like that, premise, conclusion, the problem you have is that when you start with a premise that isn't true, and people do this a lot, they take certain things and they oversimplify them to the point to where they're no longer a true statement. And you see this a lot in the fitness world because people haven't been taught basic logic, and then they start extrapolating, but they don't realize that if you're starting with a false premise, most of your conclusions are going to be incorrect. They're going to be flawed. So you've kind of wasted a lot of time and effort coming up with something. And let me discuss that a little further. You know, it's the example I was talking to my girlfriend about this when I saw that. And she's like, yeah, I mean, this is false premise. People don't know logic anymore. And it's kind of like they'll come up with a statement, an absurd statement. And if you start with an absurdity, then you come to absurd conclusions. For example, if you accept an absurd statement as true, that if I wear purple clothing on Mondays, I'm bulletproof. The purple will stop the clothing on Mondays. So therefore, if I want to rob a bank, I should do it on Monday while wearing purple clothing. So do you see how when you accept an absurdity as true, your conclusions become absurd also? Perfect example. Well, the training to failure is one of those. To actually think that training to failure is the primary factor or the only factor necessary to stimulate muscle growth is actually an absurd statement. There's no truth to it. It's actually absurd. It's way so wrong that it's not even funny. It's as absurd of a statement as the purple clothing making you bulletproof. So therefore, your conclusions, any conclusion that you reach based upon this premise is equally absurd. Just like the conclusion that we reach. So therefore, if I want to rob a bank, I should do so on Mondays in purple clothing. That's insane. See the problem? We're dealing with something just as crazy. People just don't realize it when they say something like that as far as their training to failure. And here's what I mean. The actual primary mechanism that we know from the training in, this isn't discussing the biology, this isn't discussing micro tearing, this isn't discussing metabolites, anything else. We're talking purely the training in, not the biochemistry in. Actually, progressive overload is the primary driver of muscle growth. In fact, without progressive overload, the only way you grow muscles is with drugs. But drugs still make you stronger, so you could still overload progressively if you were training. So the problem we have there is that if you accept anything else as the stimulus, then we've got a problem. And what you actually find is that any given workload, it usually takes the human body about 3 training sessions to adapt to it, and you will no longer adapt further. It's just a baseline, and here's what I mean. If, for example, you bench press 200 pounds for 8 reps on 3 separate workouts, if you do not at least reach that or increase beyond that again, you probably won't grow as a result of purely that exercise in that set. Meaning you're going to have to add something else in there. You might have to add an extra set, an extra rep somewhere. You might have to add some extra exercises, do something else to stimulate growth, because you're not going to grow on the 4th time of doing it. And let's go back to the muscle failure. Again, you have guys like Jerry Ward trying to promote this, that muscle failure is how you ensure you reached all the fibers, blah, blah, blah. That's bullshit. You're still not ensuring muscle growth just because you stimulated some fibers. And here's what I mean. If you're already strong enough to bench press the same weight using the same form, the same distance for 8 reps in previous workouts, if you hit muscle failure on the 7th rep, a week later, and you actually reach failure, you didn't stimulate any muscle growth with that set, unless it was additional volume. Meaning if you only did 1 set with 8, and then you didn't do any further, if you come and do a second set behind it where you hit 7, that's fine. But if your only set that you do, your work set, you hit failure on the 7th rep, that is less workload than you are already previously capable of doing. Therefore, something in your nervous system hasn't recovered. There's something that has stopped you from recruiting the muscle fibers to go further. Something's happened with your progress, your recovery curve. Something has happened. And as a result of that, because you're already strong enough to have exceeded that workload 3 separate times, you're not going to gain any muscle from it. Again, unless it was fatigue from previous training in the same session, because you'd already done a couple sets of 8 and then you went for a third set and failed on the 7th. But if that was your peak work set, you didn't stimulate any new growth because you stopped progressing. You've already previously exceeded that workload 3 times already. You're done. You've adapted. So you won't grow from it. And so there's the problem we run into. So there are cases to where muscle failure will produce 0 muscle growth. Even though you failed and you got some fatigue and some metabolites generated, something happened that kept you from hitting the upper threshold fibers the way you needed to push beyond the workload. Again, probably a recovery issue, probably a peripheral nervous system issue. So that's the thing to consider there. Also, when it comes to muscle failure can be a useful tool in progressive overload, because obviously if you're training to failure, you're getting some extra metabolites and you are probably reaching a new threshold. Meaning, when you start training to failure with higher reps, oftentimes several weeks in a row, the reps are going to increase because you pushed a little harder each time. You adapted to it and you were able to gain a rep, or eventually you'll get stronger from it as long as you're recovering, right? So training to failure can help ensure that you progressively overload because you're more likely to reach new reps with the same weight. And again, as long as you haven't hit the same training stimulus more than about 3 times in a row, you're probably going to keep growing from the new stimulus. So if by training to failure on a given exercise, after every 3rd time you do it, you manage to pick up a rep somewhere while going to failure, you're causing new adaptative stress that you're going to grow from. But it's not a guarantee that you're going to, and that's why we actually have to program these things. That's why recovery becomes important, periodization and things become important, so that over time you can ensure that you progress. Because if you start hitting muscle failure with loads that you have previously already surpassed by a rep, and you're not adding new workload, you're not going to grow from it, because progressive overload is the primary driver of muscle growth. So if, again, on a given exercise or exercise for the body part or lift or whatever, by the 3rd time you've done it in a row, if you're not progressing at all on anything, you've stopped growing from it, even though you're hitting muscle failure. It's just that muscle failure is a very useful tool for trying to get those extra reps. Because, again, when you're pushing it all the way out, your odds are slightly better that you're actually going to get further with it. But it's not a requirement. In fact, training to failure is not a requirement for muscle growth. Volume isn't a requirement for muscle growth. And here's what I mean. If you did nothing but picked 4 basic exercises and you did training maxes all the time on them for 1 rep, let's say the squat, deadlift, bench press, and a pin leg row. If you did nothing but 1 rep training maxes, every workout you came in and picked all 4 of those exercises and built up to a training max, what we would call RPE 9 for 1 rep, right? If you continue to add weight over the months to it, you would gain muscle from it. You can gain muscle off of single rep training maxes. You've basically come in your heaviest set, because you might do 3 or 4 singles building up, but ultimately only 1 or 2 are really heavy. So 1 or 2 heavy reps on each exercise out of 4 exercises, that's going to average about 6 heavy reps per workout of singles. If you progress on those, you'll get bigger. You'll get proportionately bigger. So if you do that and your squat goes from 200, 250 pounds, your deadlift goes from 250 to 300 on those training maxes over several months, you're going to gain quite a bit of muscle size. You didn't reach failure on anything. You never failed a rep. You didn't do really enough volume to get metabolic fatigue. But you're still going to grow. Is it the best way to grow? No. There are way better ways to grow, but you will grow from it. You will grow noticeably. Because why? Because the key to muscle growth at the end of the day is progressive overload. You are either adding weight or reps to a given exercise while moving the weight the same distance using the same basic technique. All right, as long as you are doing that, you are stimulating new muscle growth. When you fail to progress any further, that's when you stop growing. And that's why things like periodization come into play, because eventually everyone stalls. And planned periodization helps you overcome that. But muscle failure itself even training volume, all these different things that people talk about being these drivers of muscle growth is not actually true. They're useful tools for increasing workload, increasing overload. They can be very valuable tools. Increasing the volume of your training can be a valuable tool for that. Training to failure can be a valuable tool for that. But they themselves do not cause the muscle growth in isolation. They only help increase muscle growth if they help you increase the workload. Workload and progressive overload is everything. And when you understand that, then you could come to more meaningful conclusions, because all of your conclusions are going to be, if I increase the weight on the bar, if I increase the number of reps I can do, if I have to add a set here or there, anything I can do to do that, then that's going to make me bigger. So if you have conclusions that work along that line, you're heading in the right direction. But when you jump back to conclusions like, well, I just need to be able to train to muscle failure, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. You know when it's going to work? If it increases workload and overload. And when it's not going to work is when it fails to increase workload or overload, which is 50-50 that it's going to work out that way in the long term. So again, if it were as simple as just training to muscle failure all the time, all the top coaches for the top athletes in the world wouldn't be using various advanced periodization programs. Linear block periodization wouldn't exist. Undulating periodization wouldn't exist. None of these systems would exist if it was just as simple as I'm just going to train to muscle failure and I'll continually grow from that. Because it's a cute theory, but in the real world it doesn't pan out. And if it was that easy, that's all the top coaches around the world would have their gold medal winning and Super Bowl winning athletes do, because they would just get bigger and stronger from doing that. But it doesn't work that way in the real world. And this is the sort of stuff that people need to look at, though. And it really is something I notice a lot, that people come up with these hypotheses, and these ideas that if I do this because of this, but they always start with a false premise. And that's the thing you've got to ask yourself. Where did you get that premise from? Is that actually true? Because if it's not, and it's something that's actually quite absurd, in this case it's absurd, you're going to reach absurd conclusions, and you're going to find yourself going down a train of thought that wasted your time, it wasted your effort, and ultimately wasn't based upon reality to begin with. So it's important to understand these basic concepts better if you want to actually try to put thought into what you're doing. If you just want to train hard and bust your ass, that's fine. But if you're trying to actually plan something because of a thoughtful, reasonable methodology, you have to understand these concepts better, and coming up with ideas like, well, if muscle growth is caused by training to muscle failure, then if I just do this, I'll be okay. Well, you come up with absurd ideas, just like when people say things like, well, I've heard that muscle growth is caused by micro-tearing of the muscle fibers. That's not actually true, by the way. But you see what happens when people start with these false premise, these absurdities. They end up coming up with really absurd conclusions when they take them out to their farthest possible model. It's, again, when people do that, when they say, oh, well, how can I tear more muscle fibers? If I do tons of heavy eccentric only work and forced negatives and everything, that will cause the most muscle tearing. Therefore, that's what's going to make me grow. In fact, since that's all I need, in fact, we know the best way to do it is to just heavy things. We'll go get a forklift and have it lift the weight and just drop eccentrics on me that are heavier than my 1 rep max. And as long as I do those at slow eccentric, I'll get so much micro tearing that I'll be the biggest guy in the gym, because that will cause more micro tearing than traditional training. It won't make you bigger, though. It won't make you grow faster than doing conventional training. If anything, you might grow slightly slower. In fact, we know you will. You'll only grow at about 60% of the potential rate doing maximum or super maximal eccentric only using a machine to lift the weight. It's been studied. But if you go with the concept in your head, starting with a false premise that the micro tearing is what causes muscle growth, then any training method that increases micro tearing is going to be the best. So again, you see how people could come up with false ideas in their head that are absurd, and then they could come up with training methods that are equally absurd and get lesser results because they started with a false premise to begin with. And so you've got to be very careful with these things when you start deviating away from very proven, time-proven methods written by physiologists and top coaches around the world. When you start deviating from what they're recommending, you better make sure you know what you're looking at and you're not basing it upon some absurd idea. Again, a little bit of logic here. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.